The most powerful man alive never lost control until she vanished without a trace. Damian Cole stood at the center of a world that obeyed him without question. Every institution he touched recalibrated itself around his presence. Governments adjusted policies before his demands were spoken. Markets shifted before his decisions were announced. His empire was not built on chaos or charisma, but on absolute precision, a system engineered to eliminate uncertainty before it could take shape. To those beneath his influence, Damian Cole was not simply a man. He was a structure of dominance wrapped in human form. Emotion was absent from his decisions, not because it was weak, but because it was irrelevant to survival. Every layer of his life was filtered through control, and anything that could not be controlled was removed from proximity. Within that perfectly balanced machinery, Elena Brooks existed as a rare exception. She was not a public figure in his world, nor an official extension of his empire. She worked as his private assistant, moving through the highest levels of his operation with quiet precision. Her presence was efficient, unintrusive, and professionally invisible to everyone except him. Yet over time, something unspoken formed in the silence between tasks and commands. Not affection in traditional sense, but a subtle dependency neither of them acknowledged. Elena understood Damian's world better than most who served within it. It was not just powerful. It was dangerous in ways that never needed to announce themselves. Decisions made in one room could erase lives in another. Loyalty was currency, and weakness was a liability no one survived carrying for long. That understanding became heavier the moment she realized she was pregnant. The discovery did not arrive with celebration or hope. It arrived with silence, fear, and calculation. In Damian Cole's world, children were not simply personal matters. They were leverage points, vulnerabilities, extensions of power that could be used, manipulated, or destroyed depending on who gained access first. Elena did not doubt what Damian would feel. She doubted what he would become because of it. And that was enough. For days, she carried the truth alone, watching the structure of his empire from the edges of her own silence. Every conversation with him felt normal on the surface, unchanged, but beneath it, she saw the impossibility of what she was holding. Telling him would not just alter her life. It could shift the balance of everything he had built. So she chose disappearance. No confrontation, no explanation, no final message. She simply ceased to exist within his structured world. By the time Damian noticed her absence, it was not emotional confusion that registered first. It was systemic disruption, a minor inconsistency in his operational environment, a delayed response, a missing confirmation, an absence where continuity should have existed. At first, it was dismissed as procedural deviation. Then it repeated. Elena Brooks was no longer present in any active system tied to him. Her access points were inactive. Her known locations returned no verified trace. Even internal personnel records showed no recent engagement. For the first time in years, Damian Cole encountered something that did not resolve through immediate correction. He initiated a search. Quiet at first, controlled, limited to internal channels, then expanded outward into financial tracking, identity verification systems, and surveillance overlays. What began as procedural recovery soon escalated into something closer to instability, because nothing returned. No signal, no trace, no predictable pattern. Meanwhile, in another city far from the structure she left behind, Elena lived under a new identity. Her life was smaller now, stripped of luxury, security, and certainty. Every day was measured by caution rather than control. She carried her secret not as protection, but as survival. The child inside her became both her reason to disappear and the weight she could never set down. She believed distance would be enough. But she had underestimated Damian Cole. Back within his empire, the first real fracture appeared not in systems, but in him. Delayed decisions became more frequent. Focus shifted in ways no one could fully measure. Subordinates began noticing something unfamiliar in their leader's behavior. Not emotion, but deviation. Then, without warning, a classified external feed triggered inside his secure network. A medical record fragment, unverified, unassigned, but containing a name he recognized instantly, Elena Brooks, and beneath it, Data that should not have existed at all began to unfold in silence. She didn't just leave him, she erased herself to protect his child. Elena Brooks did not disappear in a moment of impulse. It was a slow dismantling of identity, carried out in silence, step by step, until nothing of her former life could be traced back to Damian Cole's world. She understood that leaving was not enough. Survival required erasure. In the early days of her discovery, she moved through life in quiet shock, her thoughts divided between disbelief and fear. The pregnancy was real, undeniable, and growing more present with every passing day. But what terrified her more than the physical reality was the emotional one. What it meant to carry something that tied her permanently to a man like Damian Cole. She loved him in the only way she had been allowed to, carefully, silently, without expectation. But love meant nothing in a world built on power structures that consumed vulnerability. And Elena had seen enough of Damian's environment to understand what happened to anything he could not control. In memory, fragments of their time together returned without warning. Moments in sterile offices where his presence filled the room before he spoke. Conversations that carried weight even when the words were minimal. The way silence around him never felt empty, but measured. There had been a strange pull between them, never named, never acknowledged, but never absent either. That connection became the source of her greatest fear. Because if Damian Cole learned she was carrying his child, there would be no separation between protection and possession. In his world, outcomes were not shared. They were owned. And Elena refused to let her child become a strategic extension of his empire. So she made a decision that broke her life into two irreversible halves. She vanished, not in chaos, but in structure. She severed financial ties, abandoned known digital footprints, and rebuilt her identity from fragments of anonymity. A new name, a new city, a life reduced to essentials. Every action was calculated to remove pattern recognition, every choice designed to avoid detection. But survival came at a cost. Without stability, Elena's world narrowed quickly. Employment was temporary and inconsistent. Housing shifted more than once as caution forced her to keep moving. Every unfamiliar face carried the possibility of exposure. Every notification sound triggered instinctive fear. Even safety felt temporary. Yet the hardest part was not poverty or isolation. It was memory. Because she was not only running from Damian Cole's world, she was running from the life she had almost allowed herself to imagine within it. At times, fear took a sharper shape. She did not trust that Damian would simply reclaim the child. She feared something more absolute, that he would eliminate uncertainty entirely. In his logic, removal was cleaner than risk, and she had seen enough of his decision-making structure to understand that emotion rarely outweighed strategy. Far away, Damian Cole's intelligence network expanded its reach. What began as isolated inconsistencies evolved into structured anomalies, financial gaps that should not exist, identity traces that partially overlapped but never fully aligned, data fragments that suggested deliberate fragmentation rather than accidental disappearance. For the first time, his system returned something incomplete but undeniable. Elena Brooks had not vanished from existence. She had been hidden within it. Damian shifted operations personally. What had once been delegated became direct. Surveillance layers tightened. Independent verification units were deployed across multiple regions. Every recovered fragment increased probability, but reduced certainty. Then a breakthrough occurred. A low-level surveillance archive, previously flagged as irrelevant, was reprocessed through enhanced recognition protocols. The system stabilized on a single frame extracted from a public camera feed weeks earlier. The image was blurred, partial, nearly dismissed, but unmistakable. Elena, and beneath the grainy distortion of the frame, one detail forced Damian's entire system into silence. She was no longer alone, and she was no longer hiding a possibility. She was hiding proof. For the first time, Damian Cole could not control the outcome. The realization did not arrive as emotion. It arrived as contradiction. Every system Damian Cole had built across years of precision was designed to eliminate uncertainty before it could evolve into disruption. Yet Elena Brooks had become the one variable that refused to stabilize under any model he applied. At first, he treated it as an anomaly. Then it repeated. Data streams that should have converged into clarity fractured instead into incomplete patterns. Surveillance grids returned partial confirmations, but never full resolution. Financial tracking led to dead zones. Identity systems collapsed into layered inconsistencies. Every path that should have led to Elena circled back into absence. And for Damian Cole, absence was not neutral. It was unacceptable. The first emotional disturbance was subtle enough that even his closest advisors misinterpreted it. A delay in response timing during a strategic briefing. A pause decision window that extended beyond acceptable thresholds. A recalculation sequence that restarted twice before finalization. These were not failures. They were fractures. Within his empire, the effect became noticeable faster than anticipated. Operational directives were held longer than normal. Financial approvals required secondary confirmation. Internal teams began receiving altered priorities without explanation. The system did not collapse, but it shifted, as if recalibrating around something no one had been informed about. His advisors noticed first, not because he spoke differently, but because he stopped delegating. For the first time, Damian Cole directly accessed tracking channels reserved for intelligence division clearance. Systems that had always operated beneath his attention were now under his direct control. Search parameters tightened. Geographic filters expanded. Historical reconstruction protocols were activated simultaneously across multiple regions. And still, nothing stabilized. Elena had not simply disappeared. She had engineered absence. That realization did not calm him. It sharpened something inside him that had never been allowed to surface in structured form. Frustration at first, but not ordinary frustration. It was directional, focused, growing into something far more consuming than logic alone could regulate. In fragmented moments between operational updates, Damian began recalling pieces of memory he had long suppressed. Not events, but impressions. Silence that once felt different. Presence that had not been categorized as threat or utility. Emotional responses that had been discarded before they could form coherence. He terminated the thought cycles each time, but they returned. Meanwhile, intelligence units confirmed a critical escalation in anomaly behavior. Elena's disappearance pattern was not passive. It was adaptive. Every attempted trace route failed not because she was invisible, but because she was actively avoiding structural predictability. She was learning how to remain unreachable inside systems designed to find everything, and that made her existence more significant, not less. Then came the shift Damian had been anticipating without acknowledging. A security breach alert triggered near one of the last verified proximity zones associated with Elena Brooks. The feed was unstable, fragmented by interference, but the classification was immediate. Unknown movement detected, not civilian, not defensive, military-grade coordination. Damian reviewed the data once, then again, and something inside his system recalculated risk in a way that bypassed all prior frameworks. Because this was no longer just pursuit, it was competition. Before his network could fully stabilize a perimeter analysis, a second intelligence layer activated automatically from field surveillance nodes. Another group had entered the same region. Heavier armament signatures. Independent origin. No identifiable affiliation with any known faction in Damian Cole's empire. They were not following his lead. They were searching separately. For Elena Brooks, and for the first time in his entire existence, Damian Cole understood something that did not belong in his world of absolute control. He was no longer the only one who had found her. The secret was not her escape. It was what she carried. Damian Cole did not discover Elena Brooks by chance. He extracted her location the same way he extracted truth from chaos, by stripping away every layer of deception until only one stable point remained. The fractured surveillance feeds, the incomplete identity traces, the overlapping anomaly reports, all of it finally converged into a single coordinate cluster. And when it resolved, it did not feel like victory. It felt like impact. Elena was alive, not hidden in theory, not lost in probability, but physically present in a defined location outside the reach of his empire's structured control zones, a civilian environment layered with minimal digital footprint, chosen deliberately to resist detection. But the system did not stop there. It continued analyzing residual biological and temporal data that had been previously flagged as incomplete. Medical fragments resurfaced, unverified clinic entries, discarded regional records, delayed anomaly reports that had never been fully processed due to lack of confirmation chains. Damien cross-referenced them once. Then the structure changed. Pregnancy confirmation probabilities surged beyond statistical uncertainty thresholds. And in that moment, interpretation stopped being necessary. The conclusion was absolute. Elena Brooks was carrying his child. For the first time in his life, Damien Cole did not process information through control logic. The realization did not integrate smoothly into his decision hierarchy. Instead, it collided with something deeper, something that had no defined operational category. It did not feel like fear. It did not feel like surprise. It felt like weight, unmeasured, uncontained, unassigned. The systems around him registered internal instability instantly. Decision cycles paused mid-execution. Threat analysis modules recalibrated without command. For a man who had never experienced delay without cause, this reaction was unprecedented. And beneath it all, something more volatile formed. Not emotional collapse, but control rupture. Rage without direction. Not toward Elena, not toward the child, toward the fact that something beyond his control had already rewritten consequence before he was given access to it. Within minutes, Damien activated full silent retrieval protocol. Elite security units were deployed under zero-exposure directives. No engagement, no public trace, no structural disturbance to surrounding environments, only extraction. But Damien did not remain behind the system. He entered it, personally. His movement triggered immediate recalibration across his empire. High-level personnel recognized the pattern instantly. When Damien Cole moved physically, the situation was no longer strategic. It was irreversible. Meanwhile, Elena Brooks began to feel it before she saw it. A shift in the environment she could not explain. Small disruptions in normalcy. An unfamiliar tightening of the world around her, as the space itself was adjusting pressure. The instinct was immediate and unshakable. She had been found, not fully, not visibly, but inevitably. Her preparation began without hesitation. Minimal belongings, emergency routes reviewed in memory, identity fragments ready for abandonment if necessary. The same survival instinct that had once driven her escape now returned with sharper urgency. But this time, she was not alone in being pursued. Unknown armed groups that had previously entered the search grid were closing in from a separate vector. Their movement patterns indicated coordination independent of Damien's system. Multiple forces converging on a single point without awareness of each other. And at the center of it all was Elena. Damien's extraction units closed distance faster than any external group could anticipate. Surveillance layers tightened. Geographic zones collapsed inward under control compression. Every route leading to Elena's location became increasingly defined until nothing remained unmonitored. Inside a fractured surveillance feed, one of Damien's forward observation teams stabilized visual contact. The image resolved. Elena Brooks had been located, and she was no longer alone. She ran from his world, but his world had already found her. Elena Brooks had spent months believing distance could protect her. Every new city, every changed identity, every silent night spent listening for danger had been built on a fragile hope that separation from Damien Cole meant safety. But as the environment around her began to shift in ways she could not explain, that belief started to collapse. Damien Cole had arrived in the region, not publicly, not visibly, but through presence that reshaped everything around it. Surveillance signals tightened. Background activity reduced. Even ordinary movement patterns in the area felt less random, as if unseen systems were adjusting to something far more dominant entering their space. Elena felt it before she confirmed it. A subtle pressure in the atmosphere, a shift in timing, a loss of unpredictability that no civilian environment naturally carried. Her instincts sharpened instantly, and for the first time since she left, she did not feel like she was hiding. She felt like she was being located. Panic did not arrive loudly. It built in controlled pulses. Her first instinct was escape, but her body reacted with hesitation she did not fully understand. The pregnancy changed everything. Every movement carried consequence now. Every decision risked more than just herself. Still, she moved, carefully at first, then faster, adjusting her path through less visible routes, trying to avoid exposure while maintaining physical safety. Her mind repeated one thought over and over. Not now, not here, not like this. From a distance, Damien observed her. He did not approach immediately. He watched through layered visual feeds and live positional tracking, studying her movement with precision that no longer felt purely strategic. Every step she took registered differently now, not as data points, but as confirmation of something he could not ignore anymore. Elena Brooks was real, and closer than she had ever been since disappearing. For Damien, the conflict was no longer about finding her. It was about what finding her meant. Control demanded structure. But something deeper, something he had never given authority to, recognized fragility in her movement, caution in her survival, and something unmistakably human beneath the fear. Before that conflict could resolve, the system detected a second intrusion, unknown armed presence, not part of Damien's operation, not civilian, not passive, hostile. The threat moved into proximity with intent, and the environment shifted instantly into silent correction. Damien did not issue visible commands. He did not need to. His security network activated in layered silence, removing the threat before Elena even registered its full presence. There was no explosion, no public disruption, only absence, systems shutting down, movement ceasing, danger disappearing as if it had never fully arrived. Elena stopped walking. Something was wrong. The kind of wrong that did not announce itself but erased certainty. She turned slowly, scanning her surroundings, realizing too late that the danger she prepared for was no longer the only presence in her world, because something far larger had already taken control of the space around her. And in that realization, fear shifted shape. It was no longer fear of strangers. It was fear of him. Her breath broke as understanding settled fully. She was not being chased through an open world anymore. She was inside a controlled perimeter that belonged to Damien Cole. And then the silence changed again. Footsteps, measured, close, certain. Elena turned toward the source just as Damien Cole stepped fully into view in front of her. The most dangerous man alive was no longer just a man. He was about to become a father. Damien Cole stood in front of Elena Brooks without urgency, without visible emotion, as if the entire world had narrowed down to this single moment of confrontation. No empire pressure. No external systems, no layered intelligence streams mattered here in the same way they usually did. Everything had collapsed into silence between two people who had once existed in completely different versions of reality. Elena's breath caught instantly, not because she did not expect him, but because seeing him in physical proximity made escape feel mathematically impossible. Every instinct she had built since disappearing activated at once, warning her of consequence. She shifted slightly, attempting to conceal the truth her body had already begun revealing. But the movement was small and late. Damien noticed. He always noticed. But he did not react outwardly. Instead, he studied her in silence, his gaze locked a precision that felt heavier than sound. For Elena, that silence was unbearable. It was not empty. It was evaluation, calculation, judgment that had not yet been spoken. Her hand instinctively moved closer to her abdomen, protected without intention, and in that single gesture, something inside Damien changed. The intelligence reports had already told him everything, but seeing it was different. Reality did not behave like data. Inside Damien Cole, control attempted to respond first. Structure, command, ownership of outcome. But for the first time, something deeper disrupted that process before it could complete. Not emotion in the way others understood it, but recognition, a truth that could not be reorganized into strategy. The child was real, and standing in front of him was the reason that reality now existed. For a fraction of a second, Damien's internal system fractured, not into chaos, but into competing directives that had never been allowed to coexist. One demanded protection through absolute control. Another demanded preservation without destruction. Neither could override the other cleanly. It created a pause. A human-scale silence inside a machine-built mind. Elena saw none of it clearly, but she felt the shift in him. The stillness was no longer cold. It was layered, heavy in a way she could not interpret safely. Fear rose immediately, not of physical harm, but of loss. Loss of autonomy, loss of the child, loss of any remaining control over her own life. Behind Damien, unseen security units had already expanded the perimeter. Every exit route was silently monitored. Every possible intrusion point was sealed in predictive anticipation. The world around them had become controlled geometry. But Damien did not look away from her. Then, instead of punishment, instead of confrontation, instead of control, he issued a command. Quiet, absolute, full protection protocol activated. Not containment, not restriction. Protection. The shift was immediate. Systems adjusted. Personnel repositioned. The environment around Elena changed from threat landscape to secure perimeter in seconds. It was still his world, but the purpose had changed shape. Elena's fear did not disappear. It evolved, because protection from a man like Damien Cole was never simple. It came with structure, with permanence, with consequences she could not yet calculate. Her voice did not come easily, but her posture held steady despite the weight of everything collapsing inward. She did not trust him, not fully, not yet, but Damien did not respond to her fear. For the first time, he did not respond anything external at all, because something inside his system had already begun changing the hierarchy of everything he had ever known. And just as the balance between them began to stabilize into something unfamiliar, a silent alert triggered inside Damien Cole's internal network. Not external, not enemy detection. Internal breach signal. Inside his own empire. His greatest enemy was not outside. It was inside his own empire. The internal breach signal did not arrive like an alarm. It arrived like confirmation of something Damien Cole had already begun to suspect the moment reality stopped behaving predictably. Inside his empire, nothing moved without permission. Nothing escaped without trace. And yet Elena Brooks had been found too easily, too precisely, as if the system itself had opened a path for her exposure. That meant one thing. Someone had allowed it. Damien did not react with visible anger. His expression remained controlled, but the environment around him shifted instantly. Every internal channel tied to high-level access was frozen. Communication between divisions was suspended without warning. Authority hierarchies that had existed for years were locked into verification loops that required identity confirmation at every step. Trust did not collapse loudly. It dissolved structurally. Across continents, members of his organization began noticing the change in real time. Orders that once flowed instantly now stalled in silent authentication layers. Operational freedom narrowed. Entire branches of command found themselves isolated without explanation. What had once been a seamless empire became a segmented system under silent inspection. And at the center of it, Damien Cole stopped delegating entirely. He was no longer observing the situation. He was dismantling it. Every data pathway connected to Elena's exposure was traced backward through encrypted layers. Financial anomalies were flagged. Communication gaps were reconstructed. Hidden authorization override surfaced like fractures in a one-solid structure. Someone inside had not just observed Elena Brooks. They had located her and passed it forward. The realization did not create emotional collapse inside Damien. It created consolidation. Every competing internal response, strategy, control, calculation, collapsed into a single directive that overrode all others. Protect, not the empire, not reputation, not legacy, the child. Elena stood nearby, watching the shift in him without fully understanding the technical scope of what was unfolding, but sensing its weight. The air around Damien had changed. It was no longer just authority. It was containment. Everything he touched now felt structured around prevention instead of dominance. For the first time, she saw a version of him that was not built for control, but for protection. And that realization unsettled her more than fear ever had, because protection from a man like Damien Cole did not resemble safety. It resembled permanence. Within minutes, internal purge protocols activated. Entire communication networks were isolated. Trusted operatives were pulled into silent verification cycles. Access levels were revoked in real time. The empire that had once operated on assumed loyalty now functioned under continuous scrutiny. Damien did not hesitate, because hesitation no longer had value. Only certainty mattered, and certainty had shifted its focus to what could not be allowed to be harmed. Elena Brooks and the child she carried were no longer variables within his system. They were the system. Even Elena began to notice the shift in reality around her. Movement patterns outside the structure became more controlled. Unknown personnel appeared and disappeared in coordinated silence. The space she occupied felt increasingly enclosed, not as confinement, but as protection expanding outward in layers she could not see. She did not trust it, but she could not deny what she was witnessing. Damien Cole was not simply reacting anymore. He was reorganizing an empire around her existence, and that change did not go unnoticed outside his world. Because while his internal systems were being cleansed, external ones were already adjusting to the instability he had just created. Deep within monitored global networks, threat indicators began converging. Multiple factions, independent coordination, no longer observing, acting. Then, without warning, every remaining intelligence feed tied to Damien Cole's empire lit up at once. Coordinated attack protocols had begun. He built an empire of fear, but she built his reason to change it. The coordinated assault did not arrive as a single wave. It unfolded as a synchronized breakdown of systems designed to never fail at once. Financial channels destabilized across multiple regions. Communication routes fractured under simultaneous interference. External enforcement units attempted containment, but every countermeasure was met with calculated resistance that suggested long-term planning rather than spontaneous aggression. This was not an attack on infrastructure alone. It was an attempt to collapse identity. Inside the secured zone, Damien Cole did not wait for escalation reports to finish compiling. The moment confirmation arrived that multiple Empire nodes were under simultaneous pressure, his entire defensive architecture activated. What had once been an empire built for dominance shifted instantly into a fully layered survival system. Every dormant protocol awakened at once, not for expansion, for protection. Elena remained within the secured environment, holding the child close as external systems shifted around them like a moving wall. She could feel it even without seeing it. The way space itself was being redefined in real time. This was no longer a hidden world. It was a controlled one. Every distance had meaning. Every silence had structure. And at the center of it all was Damien Cole. But something had changed in him. He was no longer responding like a strategist managing outcomes. He was responding like someone who had already accepted what could not be replaced. Orders were no longer delayed for optimization. They were executed instantly if they reduced risk to Elena or the child. Entire divisions of his empire moved under a singular directive that had never existed before. Preserve life at all cost. Not empire life. Family life. Inside Damien's internal structure, the final separation between control and emotion collapsed completely. He no longer attempted to categorize what he felt. The presence of the child had removed the need for interpretation. Something in him had shifted from calculation to certainty. He was a father, and that identity did not weaken him. It reorganized him. Across the battlefield of systems and networks, betrayal nodes within his organization were exposed and eliminated under rapid verification cycles. What had once been hidden fractures of loyalty collapsed under the weight of full system transparency. The empire stabilized not through fear, but through enforced clarity. There was no longer room for deception, only alignment. Elena watched him through controlled chaos, realizing something she had not allowed herself to believe before. Damien Cole was not just protecting them. He was becoming something entirely different around them. The violence that once defined him was no longer reactive. It was directional. Every move he made now carried purpose beyond survival power. It carried survival of family. And in that realization, something in her fear began to shift. The empire that once terrified the world was no longer acting like a weapon of control. It was acting like a shield. Enemy forces, expecting fragmentation and hesitation, began to retreat under the intensity of coordinated counteraction. Their advantage dissolved as quickly as it had formed. What they had interpreted as vulnerability revealed itself as transformation in progress. And transformations, once complete, cannot be reversed. Within minutes, external pressure began to collapse. Communication channels from opposing factions went dark. Retreat patterns replaced aggression signals. What had begun as an attempt to destabilize Damian Cole's empire ended in rapid structural withdrawal. The system had adapted faster than they could destroy it. When silence finally returned across the outer layers, there was no declaration of victory, only stabilization. Damian stood at the center of it all, unmoving, as reports confirmed full containment of threats. The empire remained intact, but it no longer resembled what it had been before. Elena stepped closer, still holding the child, her gaze fixed on him as if trying to understand the full extent of what had become in a matter of days. He did not speak. He did not need to, because something deeper had already been understood between them. This was no longer his empire. It was theirs. But beyond the silence of victory, beyond the collapse of external threats, somewhere far outside the secure perimeter, a different presence remained still, watching, waiting, and learning everything it could about the child that had changed Damian Cole forever, because revenge had not been defeated. It had only begun to focus.